Hello everybody, in today's video we're going to be going over 5 storms which are all out in the Atlantic. We have Tropical Storm Nicholas, we have Invest 93L, and then we have 3 other storms, one which is really notable because it could be moving up near the East Coast as a weak system, and that would be of course storm number 5, which is on the image which is on the screen right now. So we're going to be covering all of those storms. We're going to briefly be talking about storms number 3, 4, and 5, and then we'll go a little bit more in depth into Invest 93L, and then of course Tropical Storm Nicholas in today's video. So we have a ton of information. Make sure you are staying tuned all the way until the end. If you have any questions or comments, again, just leave a comment down below. And if you have any personal requests that you want me to do, or you have any personal questions, just leave an email to my email address in the description. Also send an email if you have any weather photos that you want to have featured here, so you could be featured on the weather photo of the day. That'll be, again, you just have to email the email address in the description down below. So here's a look at the current National Weather Service page. You can see that we have some air quality alerts in effect for the Northwest, and then some excessive heat warnings for some parts of the Southwest, and then even a few heat advisories in a little bit of California, and then we have some flood watches in southern Texas with some tropical storm warnings and watches offshore of the Gulf Coast. Yesterday we had a high temperature of 113 degrees in Death Valley, California, with a low temperature of 30 in Stanley, Idaho. The highest rainfall report was in Fort Pierce, Florida, where they got 3.05 inches of rainfall, and there were no snowfall reports yesterday. Here's a look at the next 5 Atlantic storms. So we have Nicholas, which is currently active as of right now. So that one's crossed off the list. We then have Odette, which looks like it will probably become one of the next couple of storms. The 2 likeliest candidates for that would be the storm north of the Bahamas, which on the thumbnail image was storm number 5. Or it would also be the storm which is south of the Cabo Verde Islands and just off of the African coast. That one also has a fairly good chance of developing. Then we have Peter, Rose, Sam, and Teresa, and that would be storm 16 through 19. So we're already getting fairly far up there. One of the reasons which I think we're all the way up to here, I think we should probably only be at storm number 9 or 10, but because of how they're doing the storms now, it's a little bit more of a strict definition. So before, we used to think about how the storm actually looked based on satellite, and how if it really wasn't too big of a deal, if it wasn't that big of a storm, if it was all the way out in the middle of nowhere in the Atlantic, chances are you're probably not seeing that named unless it's a really big storm, unless it's maybe gets hurricane status. But now we're seeing these kind of tinier storms, even in the North Atlantic, in the Central Atlantic, getting named, even if they're not going anywhere. So I think that's one of the reasons why the past couple of years you've been seeing us getting maybe all the way through the name list, and I think that's just partly due to the new reasoning that they're using to kind of point out these storms. Again, maybe 10 years ago they wouldn't even have this many storms in this hurricane season, because many of these storms that they've named have been borderline tropical storms. So that's just something that you want to pay attention to. Even though the raw number of storms is high, I think if you're looking at this, you probably, the new average, I would say, is probably closer to 15 storms per year, just based on how they've been kind of classifying tropical storms over the past couple of years. They've been a little bit more loose with that term. If you look at the Hurricane Center page, you can see those 5 storms. It's completely a mess on the screen. We have 4 different disturbances which are not named right now, and then of course we have Nicholas over in the Western Gulf. Starting off from west to east, again, we have Nicholas. Then we have Disturbance 5. That has a 50% chance of developing within the next 5 days. That is northeast of the Bahamas. We then have Disturbance 4, which is getting currently over parts of Western Africa. That's going to move offshore, and I think that does have a fairly good shot of developing. The National Hurricane Center gives it a 60% chance. We then have Invest 93L, which is kind of just hovering over the northwestern Cabo Verde Islands, and that has a 20% chance of developing. And then we have Disturbance 3, which over the next 5 days has about a 20% chance of developing, and that is closer to the Azores, and probably will make an approach somewhere closer to Portugal as potentially a very weak storm. If you look at these storms on satellite imagery, you can see they are somewhat defined. We have that one up near the Azores. That one's not too well defined, but there is some rainfall associated with it. We then have the storm which is northwest of the Cabo Verde Islands, and that one is also somewhat developed, but it's mostly just a cluster of thunderstorms, kind of a glorified thunderstorm, as you could say. And then we have also the next one, which is south of the Cape Verde Islands, currently over Western Africa. This one does look like it has some juice to it, and it could potentially strengthen quite nicely. So that one looks like, if of all the storms right now, beside Nicholas and beside that one near the Bahamas, I would say that one has a fairly good shot of developing. We then have the one near the Bahamas, and that one does look fairly strong as of right now. I think if it does get a little bit more organized, then this could easily become a weak tropical storm and potentially reach that tropical storm status before moving up near the Carolinas. This one's going to be an interesting one to track. We don't have any of the hurricane models currently tracking it, so we don't have a ton of information on it, but hopefully they do start to name this as Invest 95L or 96L, whichever one it would be. And if they do that, then we would have some intensity guidance forecast and some track guidance. Right now, we can only use the main models like the GFS and European model on the surface to track these storms, so it's a little bit trickier. But other storms like Nicholas, Invest 93L, and Invest 94L, we're all able to track that because they've named them as invests, and that means that the hurricane models now track them and put out regular forecasts for them. And then in the Western Gulf, you can see that we have Nicholas, which we're going to cover a lot more in depth in just a little bit. If you look at the current sea surface temperatures, you can see they are warm, especially over the western Gulf of Mexico, where we have Nicholas. That is quite warm water, up near 88, 89, or even 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And then all through that part of the western and central Atlantic, it's warm enough definitely for development. So it looks like if you are going to see a storm move through there, it has a fairly good shot, assuming that we don't have too much interference in the form of wind shear or any other upper air features. So if we just had this kind of clean slate of the Atlantic waters, these storms would definitely be forming a lot stronger. But because of wind shear, because of drier air masses, it is helping to kind of slow down these storms, luckily, because right now we do have warm enough sea surface temperatures to have rather strong storms. One of the things that I think will be a big player into the Bahamas storm is that we have the Gulf Stream, which moves up right here, but if you go north of there, offshore Virginia, northern North Carolina, into the Delmarva, New Jersey, and anywhere north of there, you're dealing with water temperatures that are now much cooler. So they're now into the 60s and the 70s, which is not warm enough for a storm to maintain hurricane or tropical storm status. So it could definitely weaken as it moves into there, and I would say probably every single area north of that Gulf Stream line will probably go down by half a degree Celsius in terms of the sea surface temperatures within the next week, just with the colder temperatures which are coming because of the time of year it is. So these water temperatures are going down as we speak, and that could be bad news for that Bahamas storm because it's going to be moving into those waters. So that, of course, is going to help weaken it a little bit. So that is good news for us. One of the things also with that Bahamas storm is that we don't know the track right now. We have some models bringing it into the Carolinas, other which curve it out further to the east, and some which kind of have an in-between track, somewhere in between both of them. So we are very uncertain on that Bahamas system. If we see more development, if we see more development, more guidance on that storm, then I'll probably make a full video on it because it could become something that we need to pay attention to. Right now, it looks like a weaker storm, but if anything does change, then I'll make another video regarding that. Let's move on to the individual storms. Invest 93L, located at 17.5 degrees north by 25.4 degrees west. Maximum winds of about 25 miles per hour. Minimum pressure 1,010 millibars. You can see it's a fairly weak system right now, so we're not seeing a ton of development, but there is some convective activity within here. So don't get me wrong, this is a decently sized storm. Luckily, the Cape Verde Islands not dealing with too much impact since most of the convection is on the northwestern side. But if this does get organized, if this can avoid some of the wind shear, which is out into the central Atlantic, then this could have developed. But I think because of this trough in the central Atlantic, because of this colder air, not colder air, but some of this wind shear in the atmosphere, we could be dealing with some kind of stagnation within the storm where it's not going to really weaken, but it also won't be able to strengthen all that much. Again, the one that's further to the south of here, this one down here, I think has a much better chance of developing. moving because it's going to avoid that wind shear, and it'll be having that full trek from Africa to the Caribbean where it's just water, no land masses, nothing that can really interfere with its development. If you look at the track, you can see this is expected to stay to the west. We have a few outliers which bring this to the north or even to the east, but again, that's unlikely as of right now. It looks like this will be moving to the west, and it'll be out to sea for at least the next 5 or 7 days, assuming that it doesn't move into the Caribbean. Still a possibility, but it looks like most of these actually have this curving northwest of here. If you look at the intensity guidance, you can see that this is currently at tropical depression status, not even at tropical depression status, below that, and it's currently a fairly weak system, and it looks like it's going to stagnate. We're not looking at too much development out of this, and that's, again, because of some of the unfavorable upper air elements of this system and its development path, so that could help kind of keep it in a stagnant place, not strengthening, but also not weakening all that much as well. So maybe just sticking around that 20 or 15 knot area, which is definitely not at tropical storm level. If we look at Tropical Storm Nicholas, which is, the real eyebrow-raising storm right now, you can see this one's located at 20.5 degrees north by 94.8 degrees west. Maximum winds of about 40 miles per hour, minimum pressure of 1,008 millibars, moving north-northwest at 13 miles per hour. Sorry if you can hear the dog in the background. He's barking, probably at a squirrel in the backyard. But again, this storm is actually fairly strong, and I think this one, again, is something that you want to pay attention to, and not really for the winds, but I think more of storm surge along coastal Texas, but also the rainfall. Now, this area of western Louisiana, coastal Texas, was inundated not from really Ida, but from previous systems, I believe back in July, if I'm not mistaken, or early August, where they saw a ton of rainfall. It was actually on the order of about 10 to 15 inches of rain. So when you look at that, you're not going to recover from that quickly. So while the ground is now much drier than it was earlier, it is still kind of dealing with some of those impacts from that. And then you're also dealing with whatever rainfall you got from Ida, which wasn't that much in western Louisiana, but definitely was a notable amount. So even though that wasn't, the center, when you were looking at the news reports, they were all in New Orleans or in southeastern Louisiana, not in western Louisiana or eastern Texas, they still got some rainfall out of that. So the ground is fairly saturated as of this point. So a few inches of rainfall may cause some inundation, some flooding in a few of these spots. Here's a look at the key messages. I'm not going to read them out here, but they're talking about a combination of three things, mainly the track of the storm as well as the area of tropical storm force winds. They're also talking about the rainfall, mainly across parts of coastal Texas and Louisiana, and they're also talking about the storm surge for some of these spots. So those three things, the winds, the rainfall, and the storm surge, the main threats for the system. And then, of course, some severe weather along with that. We can't rule that out since most of these hurricanes have actually brought out some tornadoes within them. So I would not rule that out. That is certainly a possibility with this system. If we look at the track, according to the National Hurricane Center, you can see that this is expected to stay as a tropical storm until about Wednesday morning. You can notice how slowly it's moving. So between Friday morning and Tuesday morning, so that's a 3-day time frame, you're moving maybe just a couple hundred miles, which is not a lot. You're moving from central coastal Texas to barely east central Texas. So you're not really moving that far within that time frame. And even though the center of the storm might be in northeastern Texas as opposed to central Texas within that three-day time frame, the rainfall will still be over that same area. So we're dealing with maybe 2.5 days straight of rainfall with varying levels of intensity, and that could definitely cause some issues. We have tropical storm warnings up for coastal Texas and a little bit of northern Mexico, as well as some tropical storm watches for the northern and central coast of Texas as of right now. If we look at the track guidance from some of these models, you can see they're fairly certain on where this is going to be. A landfall in coastal Texas, definitely the most likely solution. And then after that, it should kind of stall out a little bit before moving into Louisiana or Arkansas as a rainstorm for the most part, not really with the tropical impacts it had when it was back over coastal Texas or coastal Mexico. If we look at the tropical storm force wind speed chances, you can see that the highest chances are of course over coastal Texas, where we're looking at about a 30 to 50% chance of those tropical storm force winds. But they're also maybe up near 10 to 30% as you get into Louisiana. Even as you get into inland parts of Texas, you still have a shot of getting maybe some wind gusts up near 25 or 30 miles per hour at times. If we look at the intensity guidance for the system, you can see that we're expecting this. Right now, it is actually at a tropical storm status, so the newest run of the models isn't out yet, but we're probably starting from somewhere around here. And you can see that we're expecting that to move up maybe near 50 knots and then crash down as it makes landfall, and then kind of stagnate or maybe slowly decline into a very weak system after that as it moves inland. But again, the main threats of that when it's inland would be in the form of rainfall, not necessarily the wind speeds or the intensity of those wind speeds. If we look at the storm surge graphic from the Weather Prediction Center, or actually the National Hurricane Center, you can see that we're looking at 2 to 4 feet up and down the coast. So from southern Texas, the southernmost tip, all the way up into north coastal Texas, up near Houston, we're looking at 2 to 4 feet for that entire area. So storm surge, definitely a possibility, and definitely something that you want to pay attention to if you live along this area of coastal Texas, where you know that you're prone to seeing some storm surge. So a lot of people who live in those areas are of course going to know the impacts. Coastal Texas, definitely not a stranger to tropical storms. So I can't go community by community, but you probably know that your street floods a lot, or that it is prone to storm surge. So if you know that, then you want to take the necessary precautions. If you know that your street is maybe you're on a hill, so you don't have to prepare as much for a rain event, but you need to prepare for maybe down trees a little bit more. So you need to take your local impacts. If you live, let's say, at the bottom of a hill and you're kind of in kind of a valley, then you're going to need to prepare a little bit more for seeing some of that flooding. If you live right along the beach, then you're probably going to need to deal with the storm surge threat a little bit more, as well as the wind speed. So it's all about the local impacts, and you're going to need to figure out, what you usually deal with in these type of scenarios, what is most potent for you. If you aren't in an area that's prone to flooding, maybe just prepare a little bit. But if you are in an area that regularly floods, then definitely you want to be thinking about the storm as one of those events that could flood your area. So again, it's all about the local impacts. And you guys are going to be the people who know your community the best. Of course, I'm not going to be able to tell exactly where the flooding is going to occur, because it's going to be very, very localized. If we move on to the next page here, you can see that here's the rainfall impacts. And speaking again of those flooding impacts, you can see that for much of coastal Texas into coastal Louisiana, we're dealing with about 4+ inches of rain, all the way up to 10 inches in a few of these spots. And even inland, we're dealing with about 1 to 3 inches for most of these areas. So even if you're inland, you're dealing with 1 to 3 inches, probably not enough to flood most areas, but at least to provide some havoc on some of the roads. But mainly for coastal Texas, I would say if you live south of Houston, and kind of just if you were to draw a line from that latitude and kind of draw it along that coast, that's probably where you're dealing with flooding. So take a line pretty much down here, and if you live closer to the coast within this zone right here, I would say you probably want to prepare for flooding. This is going to be the area where you're dealing with 4+ inches of rainfall. Of course, urban areas, if you live in an urban area, you want to prepare, even if it's just 2 inches of rainfall, you might have flooding on your street, because urban areas, not as much air, not as much land to kind of break apart some of that rain. So some of that standing water is going to just kind of stay on concrete. Whereas if you're in an area that's less densely populated, where it's more kind of just grass, more forest, then you're going to have that kind of seeping into the grass. You're not going to be able to do that if you live in a big city where it's mostly just concrete, and that will kind of keep the water above ground. So that could cause, of course, some flooding impacts, and that will have maybe more impacts. So maybe 2 inches of rainfall in Houston will probably have much bigger impacts in terms of flooding than 2 inches of rainfall if it were in a less populated area, because of the less urbanization. So The more urban an area is, the more prone to flooding it is, and that's definitely something to do with infrastructure, but mainly just to do with the kind of how cities work. They don't have great water irrigation systems to kind of weed out all that water. If we look at the upper air setup of this system, it's also very intriguing because we have a trough further to the west. And if this trough were not here, then this system would probably just move straight to the east. And that's mainly because we have, again, the track of the storm is due to two different things. So we have one trough right down here, and then we have another one which is up here. So this system is moving right in between both of them, and then we have another high pressure right here. So this system is going to move right in between all of these. If this trough was maybe a little bit further to the east, then this storm would also be a little bit further to the east, and we would be dealing with a track into Mississippi or Alabama. But because this trough is located where it is, it's going to push the storm a little bit further to the west than what would originally happen. That storm again will move to the west. That upper air trough will push away to the east, and as this trough continues to move further to the east, so will the storm. So that storm is going to curve to the east as that trough is moving to the east. So this upper air feature right in here, where you see kind of the brown colors indicating drier air, is where you're dealing with that system moving through and pushing the tropical storm to the east. So I think that's one of the main components of the system. Also, if we look at the upper air setup compared to the surface setup, here's the surface low pressure, and if we look at the upper air low pressure, it would probably be somewhere here. So it's fairly well organized. We're dealing with a fairly stacked system. We're not dealing with too much separation between the bottom of the atmosphere and the top of the atmosphere. And if we just look at if we look at a sounding here, which would be right in the center of the storm, you can see that we're dealing with winds coming out of the east originally, and then as you get to the top part of the system, they start to come a little bit more out of the north or northwest. So you can see that we do have some wind shear within the mid or lower levels of the atmosphere, and that could help to break apart the system a little bit more. And that could be something that you want to pay attention to. If there's an abundant amount of wind shear, then this storm will not be able to strengthen as much as we were originally expecting. So that is going to wrap it up for today's video. Please consider liking the video, subscribing, and turning on notifications, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.